sure there's enough food for everyone. We do have food, yes. His email is in the program this morning, yeah. And it's not on the script, but I'm going to improvise a little. We also have a Wednesday book club coming this Wednesday at 7 p.m. as well. So if you want to learn more about the book that we're reading currently is called Peter and the Bible Tells Me So. So if you want to come and just like chat, this is a great opportunity to get to know people. All right. And now I'm excited to introduce today's speaker, Caroline Park. Please help me welcome Caroline as she comes.
Morning, everyone. Thank you, Lucius and the worship team. It's amazing to see all the volunteers stepping up to fill in for Caroline Park. I am a longtime member, founding member actually of this church, and a formal pastor at the River. And at the moment, I sometimes come in here to speak whenever I can. So when the staff, they were a little short staff today, as you can see. They asked me a few weeks ago to preach today and said that I could preach about anything I wanted. I thought this is the day I will share one of my favorite stories in the Bible. This story is rarely preached about on Sunday mornings, as far as I know. It's a story about a woman named Tamar who cheated patriarchy and got away with it. Doesn't that sound interesting? Tell you this, there are apparently, how many of them do you think are women? Benefit us all, our society. So whenever I get a chance, I like to share stories about women. Today's story is particularly scandalous and is R-rated, so be warned. So according to the Hebrew Bible, Jacob, Abraham's grandson, right? Abraham, who we consider the forefathers of our faith, and Jacob. So Jacob had 12 sons, and their descendants later became the 12 in both Judaism and Christianity. In Genesis 38, we're told that Judah had 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. And Tamar, whom today's story is about, was Judah's first daughter-in-law. So here, let's read the story together. Genesis 38, Judah took a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother." But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he feared that he too would die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. So let's pause here a bit. There's a lot in this first part of the story. Let me give you some background information about what's going on here. It's not fit with our church theology or our experiences, and we will get to that later. So let's set that aside for now. So Tamar is now widowed, and her father-in-law tells his second son to go into his brother's wife. And go into, obviously, is the euphemism for sexual intercourse. So why did Judah tell his son to have a child with his brother's widowed wife? And why did Onan, his son, deliberately disobey. So there's a passage in the book of Deuteronomy that helps us understand what is going on here. So Deuteronomy is the book of law. That's like its other name. And one part, the passage in Deuteronomy 25 says, was brother to her. And the first bloodline was extremely important to him and also to his family. So this custom of widow marrying her deceased husband's brother is called levirate marriage. And it helped a man continue his legacy even in the tragic event of death before having any children. It also had the benefit of providing a way for the widow to serve. So women's survival depended on having a husband or sons. The custom of levirate marriage gave them a chance to have children even after they were widowed. Right? So then, why did Onan, the brother, not want to fulfill this duty and give his dead brother a son? The text says that it was because Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. Right? Rather, the offspring would be counted as his brother's, which means it would reduce Onan's inheritance. Because with his older brother dead, Onan was he was entitled to the firstborn right, which meaning that he would have received the double portion. The firstborns received the double portion. So that he would end up receiving 2/3 of his father's inheritance. If Tamar had a son who would be counted as his brother's, then the child would be entitled to his dead brother's firstborn right, right? And the inheritance would be divided between the 3 sons instead of 2 sons, and Onan would only receive 1/4 of inheritance. So that's not spelled out here, but Onan seems like a kind of person who would care about that. And die. So he tells Tamar to remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. But he had no intention to follow through and risk his youngest son's life. In the meantime, Judah still could control Tamar and her body and would not be allowed to remarry, waiting for Judah to call her back in vain. What Judah did to Tamar here was heartless and casually cruel. And in time, the story goes, Judah lost his wife, Timnah. She saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute. So she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come into you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" He answered, "I will send you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her, went into her, and then she got up and went. Staff was also a very personal item and likely bearing some kind of identification for the owner. So basically, Judah handed over his driver's license and passport as a safety deposit to Tamar. Careless. And she conceives. Later, Judah sends his friend with a goat as a payment to recover his signet, cord, and the staff. But the friend, of course, basically he said, "Not my problem." Wrong. About 3 months later, The story continues. Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of whoredom." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." She sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these who made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." I've tied the thread saying, this one came out first. Because as I have said before, firstborn right was a big deal. And so knowing who came out first was important. But then he drew his hand back, and his twin brother came out first. The midwife exclaimed, "What a breach you have made for yourself." And so he is named Perez, which means breach or breakthrough in Hebrew. And his twin was named Zerah. What a story, right? And if you feel uneasy about the story and its heroine, I'm with you. Let me just say first that it is a pretty morally ambiguous story, full of dishonest people. But maybe that's why I like it. Let's set that aside for now. Tamar's firstborn's name is Perez, which means breach. It seems to symbolically summarize the story for us. Tamar, who was a victim of the patriarchal system that put her at the bottom of the social hierarchy as a childless widow. She breached the system with her trickery to ensure her financial security and social standing. Her tactic was not right. It is something one shouldn't do. But let's not also forget livelihood and fate depended on their fathers when they're young, before marriage, their husbands once they're married, and their sons when they're older. Similar to Confucian culture that I grew up in. This is why in the Bible, caring for orphans and widows is so important, because they had no way to support themselves. So women who lost their husbands usually remarried right away because they had to survive. He promised his youngest son to her without any intention to do so. So Tamar was stuck, powerless, living in her father's house without any future or control over her own life. What is scandalous and outrageous about the story is that she had the audacity to cheat her way to the bottom of the social hierarchy, that they were outside of the system. And because of that, Tamar's disguise as a sex worker worked like a superhero outfit and enabled her to breach the patriarchal system, patriarchal strongholds, and take what she needed and disappeared into the night. I don't know. Notice that both Tamar and Judah were widowed, both engaged in extramarital sex. And Judah was afraid of being ridiculed at most in this situation. But he so readily sentenced Tamar to death by burning. Talk about double standards. By conceiving and giving birth. So it's a fun story, problematic somewhat. But what does the story tell us? Does it tell us anything? I want to make 3 points about the story and relevant practical suggestions. And only one of these points is directly related to the story, which is that the story has the moral ambiguity and be different from Tamar's, and that it was he who wronged her. As the Jewish scholar Tikva Framer-Kinsky wrote about this story, she wrote, a man with both power and lack of understanding becomes an oppressor. Judah was privileged in his culture because he was a man and had resources. And he could not fully understand the perspectives of a very marginalized woman, Tamar, in our perspectives. Unless we make special effort to perspectives of the underprivileged and marginalized among us, we will too become oppressors. From the perspective of the privileged man, Judah, the law was clear. A widowed woman under my care cannot engage in sexual. So my first practical suggestion today is to be mindful of your blind spot and consider the perspectives of those marginalized. Think about the marginalized within our own society. Women in general, yes, but also people of color, immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants. And be mindful of their perspective. Is larger than just itself. It's that the Bible allows multiple, sometimes contradictory perspectives. Contrary to our Genesis 38, the story we just read, is that even close study does not make clear its intent. He's saying that the story of their system is not necessarily a feminist hero that we all can fully embrace, herself and her children, and she did not bring any change. It includes viewpoints originating from different contexts, different historical backgrounds, multiple theologies and ideologies to each other. That's why sometimes Bible is so confusing. Today's story is one evidence of that. The Bible is a story of a people who wrestled with God and with who they understood God to be. They attempted to explain what was happening in their. Some tried to understand the suffering in life as God going. Reading Peter N's book called Me So, which could be a good place to start. The third and last thing I want to talk about is what the story says about God. God is not bound by the values and beliefs of the biblical world. So written and edited by men, about men, from men's perspective, mostly. Men were in power, and the most important thing expected of women was to produce heirs. And I don't know if their culture was always like that, because there are some earlier stories about women leaders like Deborah. But especially as Israel developed into men and women, it's important to remember that it does not mean that God endorsed their culture, nor did God design or ordain it. Some religious people using David, according to later books in the Bible. They did not was the father of Isaac, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. It goes on from here, but I'm not going to read all the names. But I want to point out that how all of the people in the genealogy are men, except it goes like so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, who was the father of so-and-so, right? But 5 times it breaks this formula to include the mothers, and one of it is Tamar. Now, in some ways, one can say Tamar, look at this genealogy and say Tamar and her transgressions against the patriarchal ideals have been sort of absorbed back into the system, into this genealogy. And Tamar looks as if she was one of the founding members. However, it is remarkable still that the biblical authors made sure that these 5 women were included and mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus so that people like us would take notice. Tamar and the other 4 women transgressed the patriarchal norms of their days in major ways. After Tamar, there's Rahab, who was a sex worker in Jericho, the enemy town, and helped the Israelite spies. She's included. There's Ruth, a non-Jew. She was a Gentile. She was a Moabite woman, who is the grandmother of David.